Good afternoon. The first session after lunch, and this is about cricket. So, our speaker today is a distinguished personality. Often, when you are introducing a speaker, you would explain the experience or the credentials of the speaker. But in this session, I would like to explain the speaker in terms of a religion. The name of the religion is universal. In India, that religion is called cricket. And the players who participate in that religion are the demigods. Now, when it comes to religion, gods make the rules and everyone follows. But when it comes to this religion of cricket, there is a rule which everyone follows when the rain gods are not happy with the game. When the game is curtailed, a formula comes into play, and that formula is called the DLS formula. The person who makes the rules for this religion today is sitting next to me. He is indeed the S of DLS. Duckworth Lewis Stern. Professor Stern, the stage is all yours. We are all eager to listen to you because, like a good professor, should always experiment with his topics. He's not going to talk anything about DLS today. He is going on a tangent and going to experiment with a new topic for all of us in the realm of actuarial science, and that topic is about IPL. So welcome to the auction, and sir, the floor is yours. The hammer is with you.
Thank you very much. I hope you don't mind, but I hope they're not filming. I have to wander about. That's just how I am. So please forgive me, and we'll get the slides up there in a minute. Before I start, though, I like to always start with a story. And today my story is actually based on yesterday. I got in to Mumbai yesterday morning, and I came to the hotel, and I had a bit of a nap to get over my jet lag. And then I was heading down to the dinner last night, and I was at the elevator, and a lovely young lady, I don't know her name, but she came up to me and she said, "Oh, are you going to the GCA as well?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Oh, are you going to give a talk?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Oh, well, what's your talk about?" And so I said, "Cricket." And she looked at me with somewhat of a blank stare and said, "That's an unusual topic for an actuarial conference." And it dawned on me that she had no idea who I was. So it's always good to be brought down to earth and humbled a bit. So thank you very much for having me. Hopefully we will have a bit of fun. Let's see if we can, yeah, so there's all of me. So what I want to do today, though, is to, at least in principle, get my boss to be happy, which is to say, I'm not going to start the talk on cricket. Right? I do have a real job, and that real job is about data analytics. And so what I want to talk to you about initially, it'll be very brief, don't worry, is about a concept I think is very underrepresented or underthought about in data analytics. And it leads quite nicely to some examples in cricket. And so we all know that if you want to be successful these days, you have to make reasoned decisions, right? And reasoned decisions typically require relevant information. We all know that. And relevant information generally comes from an analysis of an appropriate set of data. And that's probably what we would live with as what I would call the Jenga tower of data analytics. But it turns out that if you consider this to be the tree of analytics, that there are roots underneath it that are equally as important, which don't usually get talked about too much, and that is that that data has to come from somewhere. And there are two components to where that data comes from. Right? It comes from sampling. We have to get a collection of things that we want to gather data from. And more importantly, and what we want to focus on today, we have to measure something about that, right? So I'm going to focus today on that concept there, measurement. Now, you may think that that seems a little bit silly. I mean, of course, we know how to measure things, and for most situations we do. Let's be a little bit pedantic. In order to measure something, we need three things. We first need something to measure. We need an object or an entity. It could be a person, it could be a cricket team, it could be a business, and so on. All right? We then need some quality or property about that object that we would like to know about. Now, usually those are simple things. If you're doing a business, you want to know what their annual sales were, or what their size of their staff is, so on and so forth. And those are relatively easy things to measure. But regardless, however you want to do that, the third thing you need is some sort of instrument to make your measurement. Now, if you're a physicist, your measurements are usually made with calipers and cyclotrons, right? All kinds of wonderful machinery. But if you're a social scientist, and there's a debate as to whether actuarial science is a social science or a mathematical science, but I think it falls somewhere in the middle. If you're a social science, there are often things that you want to measure which we in the data analytics business refer to as latent variables that you can't just put a caliper on. All right? And they are the things that are the tough things to measure and the things we need to learn a little bit about. Before I do talk about them, though, I also want to say that the other triumvirate associated with measurement is how to measure the accuracy of your measurement. Right? Again, if you're using physics measurements, the accuracy is probably so good that you don't even worry about it. But in general, right, for things that you want to measure about people or businesses, you have to live with the fact that you're not going to always measure exactly right. And there are three pieces to that. There's the bias, which is how systematically you're off. Hopefully your bias is zero, but sometimes you can't avoid it. All right? There is the precision, how much your measurements tend to vary. And then there's also natural variation. Right? And I like to put that in there because it's A, an incredibly important part of data analytics, which people don't usually remember, and B, it's incredibly important in cricket. All right, so what are we going to think about then today? Right? The most common latent characteristics that we want to look at, which we need some kind of proxy instrument to get at, are things like someone's intelligence, right? Or their risk aversion. Certainly if you want to set up a portfolio for someone, you need to be cognizant of what their risk aversion is going to be, right? Their financial literacy, so on. Okay, so we can learn about how to understand the appropriate way to measure latent variables, which is a crucial component in any social science, in lots of ways, but here is my choice. Here is the latent variable I'm going to look at. Which player performed the best in a cricket match? Usually, it's determined at the moment by some former player who is currently the commentator who gets asked at the end of the game, so, who was the player of the match? All right? Now, that's a measurement instrument. That former player presumably has a great deal of experience, and they may be able to look at what happened in the match and give a reasonable explanation about who the best player was. But there's going to be some error, right? If the player is a batsman, he may well have a bias, so that he's going to pick batsmen more often, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's see how we might actually systematically and more realistically come up with a way of measuring who the best players are. And I want to start by thinking about the ideas that your expert would probably base some of their decisions on, which is averages. All right? Now, averages actually are really useful metrics in test cricket, but they're not really as useful as they ought to be in the realm of one-day cricket, right? So, and the main reason for that is that, let's see if we, right? An average, you think about it, is supposed to be a conglomeration of equally relevant things that you can then get the middle of. But in cricket, right, context is crucial, right? When you score your runs and under what circumstances, makes a big difference, right? You're not the best player if you scored the last 10 runs with 30 overs left and 8 wickets in hand. Yes, of course your team was going to win then. Yes, you scored the last few runs, but that's not that big a deal. It was the people who scored the runs before you, and probably the bowlers who bowled before you, who are the more important players in the game. So we need some context there. How are we going to do that? Well, right, we're going to define or come up with a new concept which I'll call utilization, which has to do with understanding that during a cricket match, both teams have a certain amount of resources associated, right? They have a certain number of overs, 50 or 20 usually, and they have a certain number of wickets, almost always 10, right? And so we can then break down the match into how those resources are split up, and every player can be assigned a certain total amount of resources that they were associated with. And then we can ask ourselves, okay, well, how did they do relative to the amount of resources that they had available to them? Right? How are we going to decide and measure resources? Well, I hate to blow my own horn, but that's what DLS does. The whole modus operandi of the DLS formula is to essentially assign a value, a relative value, to every ball in every circumstance of the innings. And that way you know that if some of those balls are taken away, you can calculate what percentage of the resources have been lost, and then do a percentage readjustment. If one team loses 22% of their resources and only have 78% left, then you know that what they should be asked to chase is 78% of what they were asked to chase before. That's the fundamental realization of DLS. Okay, I'm going to put the next slide up there really quickly because I have to show off. It's required in my contract. There is the DLS formula. Don't worry, you don't have to remember it. I put it up there for a couple of reasons. One, I like to show off. That's just me. Right? But the other is that I want you to realize that it's not as horrible as it looks, and in particular, there is no factor in there which is designed to help Australia or hurt South Africa. All right? It's just numbers. That's all it is. And as I said, behind that, it gives us a relative value for each ball. And so with that, we can construct a more contribution-oriented assessment of what a batsman or a bowler has contributed to the match. And we do that like this. Right? We say, imagine that you know every ball that a particular batsman was associated with, and you know that value rho K there, which is the value of that ball relative to all the other balls in the innings. It's its resource percentage. Then I can calculate what should have happened during a particular batsman's innings if that batsman was replaced by an average of all the other batsmen. Right? These kind of replacement statistics are very, very common in sports analytics, and try to measure, say, well, look, you can't take a player out and then just do nothing because another player was going to come in, right? But that player may be worse, maybe better, and so that's what we're going to do. So the sigmas are the actual score that the batsman accumulated, and the UI times rho K is what you would have expected to happen on that ball if the average of the other batsmen were there. All right? And I'll call that the net runs attributable. It's the net runs that each batsman has. We can do the same thing for bowlers. The formula is a little bit more complicated. Oops, there it goes. It's in there somewhere. It's a little bit more complicated because, oops, have we lost? Where's my bowlers? There we go. All right? It's a little bit more complicated because of the extras. That's the only difference. You have to account for no balls and wides. All right? Same basic idea. All right, so there is my new metric as opposed to averages or expert opinions. All right? So we also have one last little bit. I was going to throw this slide up there, and then I just changed my mind. That's just too much symbols. Right? Technically speaking, the adjusted, so the net runs attributable is based on just averaging all the other players. That isn't necessarily completely fair yet either, because typically the opening batsmen face the best bowlers, and the batsmen at in the tail face the worst bowlers. So we can come up with an adjusted version of the net runs attributable, which accounts for what players on the other team you had to either bat or bowl against. right? So that's what the adjustment. It's not a big adjustment. It doesn't do a huge amount, but it tries to account for that. And so these are now measures which are totally calibrated, unlike the averages were, right, to be based on something which is contextual and which is conceptually based. It's not just, right, an expert saying, oh, I think. All right? Now, they're hard to calculate. But if I had to say that there was one moral of this entire talk, that would be it. Just because something's hard to calculate doesn't mean it's wrong, and just because something's easy to calculate doesn't mean it's right. We have spent a lot of time in the mathematics, actuarial science, all other quantitative field communities, doing a lot of things because we could do them with pencil and paper because they're easy. And because if we didn't do that, well, right, up until recently without powerful computers, we were stuck. Right, but now we have powerful computers. There's no real reason to stick to, I have to be able to do this with a pencil and paper. Right? All right, so, right, now, just because it's complicated doesn't mean it's actually better to do. So we also have to test it a bit. So I've got three, and we'll see how well we go with time here, but I have three different ways of trying to test this. The first is to just compare it to things like the average. So what I've done is in the IPL leagues from 2010 to 2013, don't ask me why those years, it's the data I have, and it's full of my favorite players, right? It's when Jacques Callis and Chris Gale and Shane Warne were playing, right? So I picked those years, and what I did was I calculated the average adjusted net runs attributable for all players in all those games, and I compared it to a couple things. Here is a comparison against their batting average. So you can see that batting average isn't terrible, or maybe the other way around. Adjusted net run rate isn't terrible. They map up pretty well. You can certainly see what you expect, right? Kevin Peterson and Chris Gale are the top players in that era, right? You have an emerging Virat Kohli. I think he started in 2010, so he's not quite yet up to his, but look what so the average is doing him a bit of a favor, right? He's on the lower end of the adjusted net runs attributable, but his average is, why is that? Well, when he started, he batted like most starting batsmen do. They batted in the middle order. They get a lot of not outs, right? And so your average is, right? That's the same reason that's why Mike Hussey is in there. Mike Hussey was the king of not outs, right? Now, some people say that's a skill, and it probably is, but right, it does mean that the average. One of the things that they used to do to adjust for this, right, is say, well, what we should do is take your average and add your strike rate. That sounds reasonable. Pretty ad hoc, though, right? Why not 60% average, 40% strike rate? Or 40% average, 60%, right? You can do any of those, right? NRA at least has some fundamental conceptual basis. But you can see, right, it wasn't a bad idea. They match up pretty well. All right, what about the bowlers? Here's the comparison. Now, remember, the bowlers are going to go the other way, right? The net runs attributable are always positive for you, but for a bowler, you want your bowling average to be small. Right? So there's a negative relationship there. And you can see there's a bit of a problem. Bowling average is a little bit problematic if you only get one or two wickets, yeah. Right? You get a bit of a skewed, or well, it's not really skewed, it's a highly variable outlook. So instead, and this is probably more useful in limited overs cricket, we can compare to economy rate. And so the net runs attributable are not that vastly different from things that might be deemed to be the traditional. Right? That's a good thing. We don't want our new method to say everything we did in the past was complete rubbish. But at the same time, we want to say, well, but we could probably do a bit better. All right, so here's the next thing I want to do. I'm going to say, right, I can calculate the adjusted net runs attributable for every player in every match. You know, I can go through and look at who was the highest value there and see if that corresponds to who the experts picked as the man of the match. All right? So here we go. All right? First of all, I'm going to have to create a slightly new statistic, which is the combination of your batting and your bowling runs, right? Because otherwise all-rounders will get completely covered up in the mix. All right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the 280-odd matches that were in that data set I had, and I'll have a look. So only about 50% of the expert picks match exactly my best choice. Partly that's because, as you can see, sometimes my best choice picks a player on the losing side, which is almost never what the man of the match pickers do. Right? But even if you pull that out, you still only get about 60%. However, look what happens if I say, well, is it among the top 3? So have they picked somebody that is pretty good, but isn't what I would say is the best? And that happens 80% of the time. Now, you might think would be disappointed in that, but I'm not. I'm not at all, because I want to make something which is saying to me, look, it's reasonably close, but it could be way better. Right? So I feel I've got an underlying, right, as I said, mathematical conceptual justification, and therefore my approach is better to picking the player of the match. All right. Really, at this point, I just want to do a few things to show you how this actually works. I've got a few examples, some of my favorite matches, to show you how I think that the experts get things wrong. Here's a match from, I should have got the dates, I don't remember. All right, so a match between Kolkata and Hyderabad. And the in red player there, Gautam Gambhir, was deemed the player of the match. And if you have a look, you can see that he's the only player on the batting side who scored more than 50, which is a notable milestone. And so presumably that's why he was given the award. Right? However, if you calculate all of the net runs attributable, you'll notice that Jacques Kallis actually contributed way more. Right? He got 47, which isn't quite 50, but off 20 balls instead of 45 balls. And look at his bowling. Just on his bowling alone, right? He would have been the best player in the match. So I would strongly argue that I got this one right, and the experts got this one wrong. All right? Let's try another one. Here's another match between Mumbai and Kochi. In this one, again, Brendan McCullum. Not a bad choice. He scored 80 off 60. That's pretty good. Poor old Sachin probably would have been the man of the match if his team had won, right? And he got a not-out century there. But again, let's have a look at this, right? The overall best player is clearly R.P. Singh. He only allowed 15 runs off his 4 overs, and remember, that's as many as you can get. 4 overs and you're done in 2020. So he had an economy rate of under 4, and everybody else had economy rates that were 9, 7. He's the one who won this match. It's just that he didn't take any wickets in doing it. But who cares? Right? He won the match. Okay, just to prove to you, though, that we don't always get it right, here are a couple that are of some interest. So here is a match where D.R. Smith was given the award, even though he bowled 2 overs for 26 runs and no wickets, which is terrible. And he only scored 24 off 16 balls, which isn't bad, but it's not a lot. And there are plenty of other people there. Look at it, again, poor old Sachin, 74 off 44. Indeed, if you look at net runs attributable, Sachin is way ahead. But what happened in this match was that Mumbai got to 3 balls left. They needed 13 runs off those 3 balls, which is pretty unlikely. And D.R. Smith hit a 6 and 2 fours and won the match. I think you have to kind of give that to him, right? Even though it isn't statistical, right? He did kind of win the match. And then my last one is another, it's probably my favorite match in all of the IPL. I've got both of them up there for you now. So the player who won the man of the match here was Mitchell Johnson. He took 3 for 27, which is pretty impressive, right? But it wasn't quite as impressive as the 2 for 6 that Malinga took. The issue is, though, that if you go back and have a look at this match, Mitchell Johnson gave away 20 runs on his last over after the match was already finished. Right? They said the game was clearly going to be won by the Indians. So that last over shouldn't have counted. And he had 3 catches dropped. He should have been 6 for 7. Right? So that's why he was deemed the man of the match. And that's something that the expert could see, but which we don't get a chance to. Right? So those are a bit of the fun. the last few slides I have is the last test we had, and it's just a quick little picture. As you know, every year, not every year, every couple years, they have an auction, and it's interesting to see what that tells us. There's a plot of the adjusted net runs attributable and the auction price. And there's some very fascinating things that go on there. I'll leave you with this one thought. You'll notice that all of the players who are overvalued, in other words, above that regression line, are young Indian players. And that's because the auction is not always about winning matches. It's about making profit, getting fans in the seats. And so if you get a young up-and-coming local player, you might well get a lot more attendance. And so that's where that happens. Okay, thank you very much for your time. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that either Mayur or any of you have.
So what I realized, Professor, was that in this session, we were the most sportily dressed amongst the speakers since the morning. We also discounted the bowlers.
Yes.
And we proved that even all this analysis that happened, the bowling was not held at par as much as the batting is, and cricket remains a batter's game. So this
true.
brings us to a very fundamental, and that's my question to you, a quick one, and one question from the audience perhaps, is when we talk of risk and risk-based capital, previous session, our focus is always on principles-based and not formula-based approach. While often when the player of the match is picked up, there will be a conflict between principles and numbers. So just not being quantitative, but looking at the principles-based, whether it comes to supervision or assessing the capital, is an important learning which we can pick from here. Importantly, in cricket, especially in T20, because it's a momentum game, the correlation factor at the turning point of the match, when the momentum changes, is so very important, and the performance at that particular point in that circus becomes relevant. So what are your thoughts on correlation as well as understanding principles versus quantity?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. I actually wrote a paper with a couple of colleagues from the University of Melbourne, where it was a finance-based paper, and it was talking about investment strategy. And they were using cricketers as a proxy for how people behave under different pressures. So the idea behind this was, what happens if you are a fund manager and at the moment you're doing really well? You're well ahead of the average return. Do you keep taking risks, or do you be more cautious to make sure, right? Because you could wind up with a 20% return, but you might kill yourself. And vice versa, if you're below, do you take more risks? And they were trying to see if you could tell patterns on that from cricketers' behavior, because here we can tell. At any moment in a cricket match, I can tell you what the par is, and so I can tell you whether a team is well ahead or well behind, and then we can see, do they start taking more risks in their batting or less risks? Right? Some teams take less risks because they think, well, we're in a tournament, I need to lose by a small amount so that my net run rate isn't bad or whatever it happens to be. But in a one-off game, they might do it differently. So you're absolutely right. There's a trade-off between the mathematical and the perceptual, but I think the two don't talk to each other at the moment, and they should.
They should.
They can learn from each other.
There should be the focus on the principle that finally it's a team game, and the person who performs for the team at the right moment should be given the better score as compared to someone who just looks better on the scoreboard. One question from the audience before we end the session, please. We have someone from the Makkah of cricket. He stays very close to the Lords. Dilipda.
First, I must say it's one of the most interesting sessions that I've ever attended. And this is quite a compliment, considering that I've attended a lot of those conferences. Now, only thing I wanted to point out, there's a
Hold
third...
it closer.
One thing I wanted to point out, that there is a third component in cricket, that is the fielding. You haven't touched the fielding. Fielders make a lot of differences.
So,
Fielding, fielder.
Fielding.
Ah,
Yeah,
yes,
correct.
well,
Catching, run, stopping run.
And-
That's a
and-
very
and-
important component. So how do you
Absolutely.
factor that? That's more difficult to quantify.
You are absolutely right.
But how do you do it?
And to my shame, I have a very good cricket playing son who's currently 24, and he's a wicket keeper. And he never gets picked in the top sides because all of his best games are 3 stumpings and 2 catches, and nobody ever cares about that. You're absolutely right. It is my current mania to add fielding to this. The trouble is that data is scarce, right? And so the only way for me to actually do it would be to actually sit and watch games myself. I cannot seem to hire graduate students to do it for me and go through and look at each ball and say, yes, that was a good piece of fielding, or no, that was a bad piece of fielding. But you're absolutely right, and thank you for that question.
I may
because
just
it's a very
quickly
nice
add
one.
to this that my coaches, you tell me that whether you did well with the bat or ball is often sometimes not in your hands.
Yes.
But if
But
you
fielding
field
always
well
is.
and you go back home, it's therapeutic. You will not have a depression if you gave everything for the team.
That's a very good point. Okay, well, I think we've taken up as much of the time as we have allotted. Thank you very much for your indulgence. I appreciate it.